Today, I am talking with NP Thompson about the Arcanium Saga, the middle grade fantasy series. Thank you for hopping on to chat.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Me too, especially because we have some accolades to cover. The first book in the saga, River of Crows, was a finalist for the 2023 Canadian Book Club Awards and a 2023 Wishing Shelf Book Awards Silver Medal winner. And it was shortlisted for the 2024 Rubery Awards. This is incredible. So clearly, people need to be tuning in and paying attention. And I'm excited to talk today because the fourth in the saga recently came out. But for the discussion, we'll be talking about the first book and the story as a whole. So that way, our listeners, you and your middle grade reader can start there. So for our first question, I want to know what compelled you to write a middle grade fantasy series?
Middle grade is really where my heart is. It's such a versatile age group to be writing for. First of all, because it covers such a wide range of ages, but also middle grade is kind of the one space really where no matter how you're writing things, if you're touching on even darker subjects, it always ends up being hopeful. So you can talk about sort of scary stuff or things that are happening in the world, but you always find a way to bring the reader and the kids back to a hopeful space. So it's a way to help you can help kids work through some of the stuff they might be feeling about things that are happening, but you always want to bring them back to a hopeful place and feeling good.
That makes a ton of sense. It's been a minute since I've read middle grade literature myself, but thinking back on the books that I did read when I was at that time in my life, it absolutely all makes sense.
I still read a lot of middle grade stuff. There are just so many out there right now that are just fantastic. So, I highly encourage anyone, even adults, go read some middle grade stuff. There are some really fantastic books out there.
So digging more into this specific story, I'm wondering how did you brainstorm the main characters in River of Crows, Ty and Aislinn?
So, Ty and Aislinn actually both just showed up in my head at the same time, and they were who they were right from the very beginning. And I knew a lot of the points of their personalities and how their sort of behavior would be and how they would look at the world. That came really, really early with them. The other characters sort of came as the writing progressed for that story. And so Sasha and her brothers came later, and the adult characters sort of came in later as well. But Ty and Aislinn were there right from the beginning. We're sort of the genesis of it. Like the River of Crows, I wrote because of the crows. I live in a part of town where in the fall and in the winter, you can see the river of crows crossing the sky every morning and every evening. And no matter what I'm doing, like if I'm out shoveling the driveway in the middle of winter and the crows are going by, I will stop and I will just stare at them. I love them so much. And it's so amazing to watch that river flowing across the sky. And I always wanted to write a book that would involve that. And then when Ty and Aislinn popped into my head, I was like, okay, this is how this is happening.
That's incredible that you were able to take the natural surroundings and inspiration from where you live and this natural phenomena, and then you have these characters and you can merge them together and the story flows out from there. I love to hear that. So, River of Crows, the first book in the Arcadium Saga, is a portal fantasy, which has been an ongoing theme in children's literature, all the way back to classics like Alice in Wonderland or Chronicles of Narnia. So, I'm wondering, how did you take some of the elements of a portal fantasy story and work them into River of Crows?
Well, when we're talking about portal fantasies, there are elements that are common across all portal fantasies, right? So there's the crossing over, the portal itself, and that can be very different. Sometimes it's a tunnel, sometimes it's an actual, in my book, it's an actual magical portal that's sort of like a shimmering mirror that appears from a spell. There's one that I read where it was like a ring of fire that was sort of the portal effect, which was very cool. So there's always the crossing over aspect, the portal itself that gets the characters from one world into another. So once they're on the other side, there's usually a helper character, a guardian, or someone who's going to give them some information or help them to get started on their journey. In my book, in River of Crows, it's a character, his name is Archimedes Lugenblatt, and he's a hob. He's very, very tiny. So he's only about 1.5 feet tall, and he's an author and a former professor, and he's obsessed with collecting things. And the kids start to learn more about what's happening in the world when they meet him, and that's when they find out about a prophecy that this professor thinks that they might be part of, and they get going on their way with that. And he gives them the tip to where they can find someone who can maybe help them get back home again. So that's sort of how they get started on
I
their adventure.
Yeah, I think that's really, really it's so important for children's literature and middle grade literature that that symbolism is like a little bit more clear, right? Like when we're thinking about grown-up literature, that like them beginning the quest, they don't literally need to step through a door, but that's such a helpful way for younger readers to be
Mhm.
paying attention and understand, okay, things are gonna get different now. And I love that there's someone on the other side shortly after the crossing to kind of guide them on their way, especially when these characters are kids and they're kind of figuring out what's going on, and I think it's really fun when the guardian character has such a fun, unique take on it. I love that he's about a foot and a half tall.
Huge. I just did a classroom thing a few weeks ago for grade 4 and 5 students, and they gave me a book of drawings that the 2 classes had done, and I was flipping through them, and a lot of them were obsessed with Archimedes, so I got a lot of pictures of him, so that was really great. So, it
Oh,
was a lot of fun.
that's amazing. I wanna
He
see
is he
those.
does seem to be one of the favorite characters.
I That reminds me of Mr. Tumnus in Chronicles of Narnia, like,
Mhm,
he's right there, he's not a human creature, indicates, "Oh, this is, something's different going on," and guides Lucy on to, the beginning of her time in Narnia,
mhm.
so that's what stood out to me. And as I'm thinking about children's literature or middle grade books, I'm often thinking of the themes of kids that are handling real world problems because the adults in their lives have let them down. For me, the biggest call to example of that is like the Baudelaire orphans in a series of unfortunate events, or if we think a little bit, older shifting up, like the tributes in the Hunger Games. So I'm wondering, how did you think about that theme when you were plotting out the Arcanium Saga?
That was something that I actually dealt with specifically because one of the things that I notice happens a lot in children's literature is that the adults are oftentimes, it goes even beyond negligence. In some cases, they're outright cruel or abusive. And I specifically did not want to write that kind of book. What I wanted in my book was for kids to know that the adults around them would care about them, especially like with a lot of, especially in fantasy, it's usually horrible, awful, cruel adults. Orphan child is abandoned and left to their own, and nobody cares. I wanted them to know that if ever they disappeared for any reason at all, the adults and the people who care about them in their lives would be looking for them and would be upset that they were gone and would miss them terribly. And I wanted that to come across in the books. All of the books in the series are written from multiple points of view, more so in the later books. In the first book, I mean, obviously, we're concentrating more on Tiny's and there's sort of fewer chapters from other people's perspectives. But as we go on in this series, you do get other people's perspectives coming in, and you get some chapters that are from adult perspectives as well. So you see the parents trying to cope with the fact that their kids are gone and trying to figure out what happened and what they're going to do about it.
Really appreciate that take. I feel like one of the things that I'm starting to see in books in general and books that I gravitate to is when they take, whether it's a trope or a theme and they turn it on its head and explore it in a completely different way. Because you're right. I think one of the things that when I started getting older and maybe growing out of like middle grade and then eventually growing out of YA books is I was like noticing that as a theme. And I was like, how do none of these adults care that their children are gone? And obviously,
Yeah.
sometimes it works, but sometimes it's like, "Can't we do this a different way?"
Yeah.
Like, it's as a reader, when something is so common for me, it becomes hard to, like, suspend my disbelief that this would continue to happen. So I appreciate that there's a story that acknowledges that this is a recurring theme in this, section of literature and does it a different way because that's definitely something that when I was a younger reader was like eventually was like, "I'm catching on to this."
And even
Unrealistic.
in books 2 and 3, you really sort of get into that because the parents, so Aislin's mom and Ty's dad actually, they join forces to go looking for their kids, and they find their way over to Arcania as well. And they get into all sorts of magical mayhem as they're trying to find their kids.
Yeah, ton of fun. Like when I learned that this was a 7-book saga, I'm like, "What's gonna be in there?" And now it's like, "Oh, this is how you fill a 7 saga. You see all the different perspectives of the world, and it makes it that much more of a rich and interesting story. We're not just hearing from the main character's point of view. We're seeing a little bit of everything that's going on. I think that's really neat and probably something to keep, readers more engaged. So another thing that I really appreciate is friendship is such an important theme in this story. A very important theme in middle grade as these kids are navigating like a tough time in their lives as they're, you know, leaving childhood and approaching adolescence. So I'm wondering, what was your favorite way that you impart the theme of friendship within the Arcanium Saga?
There are a lot of ways that I sort of deal with friendship throughout the series, and initially, it's dealing with sort of how it can be different for everybody and how because all the kids in Team Arcania, they have very, very different personalities, and they sort of get together sort of out of just sort of coincidence initially, and but then they sort of team up because they find that they have sort of similar focuses that they're trying to achieve. So like Ty wants to get home, Aislin's trying to find her brother, and the Sakuma siblings are trying to find their missing parents, and they all sort of band together as kids to try and form this group to try and get everybody's things done. So they sort of all form friendships despite their very, very different personalities. And there's also a wide range of ages in this group of kids. So Shay is the oldest of the Sakuma siblings, and he's 15 in the first book. And the other kids range in age from 11 and 3/4 to 12 and a half. So it's, you get to sort of see how that works as they all sort of develop their friendships throughout the course of the book. And I think it's especially salient with Aislinn because she came to our world as a refugee from this magical world. So she's always been a bit different because of that and has always had trouble making friends because she's the weird girl who's obsessed with magic and everybody knows magic doesn't exist, except, she does because she's from a magical world. So she's always had problems with that. And especially in book one, as she's trying to adjust to being part of a group and suddenly having friends for really the first time in her life, it's a bit rocky in places. And so you see her working her way through that. You see Ty trying to help her with that and how it sort of pans out with the other kids. And it's interesting for me to see her develop as an individual and as a friend. So that was fun to write. And in book four, which just came out in November, I think it was. That one is sort of the follow book after there was something major happened at the end of book three. And all of them are trying to figure out how to deal with that because awful things happened and it's affecting everybody differently and they have to sort of reform their friendships and work their way through healing basically as friends with book four. So that was also an interesting one to write.
That's a really, I think, important lesson for kids to learn, right? And I feel like when we see like a single story for kids, friendship is often an important theme, but by following the story over multiple books, longer time period than what you can often cover deeply in one book, you're seeing how friendships change, you're seeing how friendships get tested and how you
Mhm.
overcome those, that you can have disagreements or you can go through difficult things and you have to work together and you have to prioritize the friendship and communicate. And that's just a really, I think, a great lesson for kids. And what a way to end a book and then start the next one. Anyone who read book three and had to wait for book four to come out, I'm sure that was a torturous wait.
There's somebody left a review for book four, and one of the things they said was that it dealt with stuff that this type of book doesn't usually deal with. And it's what happens after, the big bad has been conquered because it's not all sunshine and roses. And book
Right.
four does touch on that. So these kids that's the other thing is like none of the books that I've read before sort of deal with the obvious sort of trauma that any normal person, especially a child, would be dealing with after having to confront something, scary and dangerous and evil and, an adult, much more powerful figure than they are. So that was something that I did touch on in book four. And that's part of the things that they're all trying to deal with is how they're sort of coping with all that. I mean, it's still hilarious. I still have the funny moments and all the hijinks and action and yeah. So
What a way to have to combine I don't want to say mandate, but for lack of a better word, the mandate in middle grade literature that everything ends up okay at the end. But that doesn't mean that along the way it's not tough. And I admire authors that are taking on those tougher topics that the genre usually doesn't take on because you can still find a way to wrap it all up by the end and good will triumph over evil and all of
Mhm.
those important, messages that we want to impart to kids of that age range. But along the way, I think it's really great that you're taking it on and that readers are picking up on it. And hopefully, that's a reason to pick up this series that that along the way it's going to test your reader in a good way and be good material and what a like rich discussion topic if a
And
parent and a child are reading together.
yeah, and you bring up a really important point there as well, in that, especially with the world the way it is today, is everybody expects things to be instantaneous and they expect it to be frictionless. I want what I want when I want it, and I don't want to hear anything more about it. Right. And that's just not how the real world works. Some things take time. And especially when you're working with a series, you can show some of that. You can sort of show the development over time. You can show how things affect people and how they work their way through it and still make it, entertaining and age appropriate. It's important for kids to know that they can do hard things and that they can have that sort of determination and the grit to get through things that are tough, and they can work together and they can triumph in the end.
I've seen a lot of content online from parents of young children about building frustration tolerance, where understanding that you don't get what you want whenever you want it. And one of the big examples is like streaming television. In this day and age, you can put anything you want on at any time. And I think that that's an important thing that we can, explore in literature in this day and age and kind of reinforce that lesson for kids or teach it if it's kind of the first time that their parent is guiding them through this concept. So next, I do want to talk about like the series planning and the writing process. I think that's always really fun to talk about with other authors. So in book one of any fantasy series, we're just learning about the characters and the magical elements of the world. We don't know everything yet. We're just kind of getting our feet wet into the world. So I'm wondering, how did you approach the world in the first book, knowing that there would be way more to come in the full saga?
Okay, I had originally planned to write a trilogy, and then I was plotting out to book 3, and I realized there's a bunch of stuff I still haven't, tied up here. The crows haven't been saved yet. This hasn't happened. I was like, okay, I guess I'm writing more than a trilogy. So at one point, I actually thought I was going to do 9 books. It was going to be okay. Well, I guess I'll do 3 sets of 3 because 3 is supposedly a magical number. So that was going to be it's a fantasy series. We'll do 3 sets of 3, and they were going to have like their own sort of titles for each of the sort of 3 trilogy sets within the overarching thing. But as I started plotting out and writing the rest of the books, I realized this would work as a 7-book series. So that's where we are right now. And there'll be a set of short stories to go with it. But in terms of planning, so there's the planning for the series as a whole, all the things that have to happen for the series. And then each book has its own sort of planning process that I go through, because you need each book to be sort of a coherent whole on its own, right? So it has its own story arc and all the things that have to happen. But at the same time, you have to keep track of all the things that are happening in each book so that it makes sense with the series as a whole and you're not losing pieces. So that's sort of because just the way that I've written this series with the multiple points of view, and with that comes there's different groups of people who are all sort of going on their own sort of adventures, all with as part of the greater whole. So it's like this tapestry, and you don't want to lose your threads. So you always have to know who's where and when, and making sure that, okay, so these people have to be here before this happens, but I need this to happen here. And there's a lot of planning that goes into something like this.
It kind of ties into another question I had planned that I love to ask people. How much do you plot out versus, the phrase is plotter or pantser? I'm wondering, how much do you plan in advance before you start writing it, like you're actually doing the drafting versus let come to you as you are drafting the book?
So I do both. I always have a plan. So again, there's that plan for the whole series and how that's going to pan out. And each book has a plan, and I have points and things that I want to chart through for the structure of the story. But as I'm writing it, things always change. So you're writing stuff and you have plans. Your character's going to do this, and then your character's like, no, that's not working for me. I'm going to do this instead. And then you have to shift a whole bunch of things around to work that in. And as you're writing, you'll also get ideas for other things that you hadn't sort of started out with. So in book 4, for instance, there's a new character gets introduced that I hadn't really started out planning to introduce this new character. It just sort of happened, and I was like, ooh, ooh, if I do that, then I could do this with, the next book, and that can tie into this person's storyline. And so there's a lot of both that happens. You have the structure just because, I mean, a story needs structure, right? There's beats and things that people expect when you read a story, and it doesn't I don't know how else to explain it other than say it doesn't feel right to a reader if
Right.
you don't have that type of structure in place. But when despite you're doing that, you still want to leave yourself open for sort of the muse to speak to you as you're writing, and just have those sort of bursts of sudden insight and creativity for your story. You want to leave space for that to happen as well. And I think having both of those happen in a story, I think that makes your book just stronger overall.
I completely agree. I have the first book that I ever wrote, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a plan. I was just like, I have an idea and I have to get this down on paper. We'll figure it out later, right? And I don't think that's an invalid way to go about it. But now I know that, plotting in advance can mitigate some of the problems that come from it.
Mhm.
And I've tried to get more into I'm going to plot this out because I think it'll make my life easier when it comes to drafting. However, I love letting new ideas come to me. Just this morning and last night, I've just been brainstorming my next work in progress and
Yeah.
just starting to plot it out, and new ideas are coming to me. And I've only written, 2,000 words of this thing. And I'm like, oh, wait, if this happens, then this can happen. And if this happens, then that can happen. New ideas come all along. So I very much am of the agreement. You go in with some kind of plan, but you need enough wiggle room that you can work in those ideas that make the story
Yeah.
stronger. And having a little bit of that creativity as you're writing will allow you to solve problems, like solve your writing problems, but allow the characters to experience things and impart the themes that you want to impart in new and interesting ways rather than going into it too formulaic. Because as a reader, I think that's one thing that
Yeah.
whenever I'm over a genre, it's because I'm like, I'm seeing the same things over and
The
over
same
again.
thing.
And I love something that keeps it fresh and grips me
Yeah.
as a reader.
So you have two really interesting points there. So one of them is this concept a lot of people seem to have when they find out you're a writer. It's like, well, where do you get your ideas? And it's like, the ideas are not the problem. Most people, once they start writing, there's no end of ideas. I mean, the problem is there's just not enough time in a lifetime to use all those ideas. The other problem is you have this amazing idea and you didn't write it down. And then you're like, I knew I had this fabulous idea and I can't remember what it was. So that's one of the things I always tell people is write it down. Even if it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, write it down because you're going to tell yourself you remember it in the morning and you will not remember it. And you will know that there was something there. You will not remember what it was and it will torment you forever. Have like a digital folder or a notebook that you just scribble things down so that you can refer to those later and you can use it later. And that also goes for pieces that you have to edit out of your writing. So there's one scene that I had for book 2 that I was going to use, and I just ended up cutting that whole chapter because it just wasn't working with it, but it's sort of in another thing, and I think I'm gonna turn that into one of the short stories for the short story section. So, I mean, there's always stuff. Always save your stuff because you can use it again later, maybe.
On the weekends, I turn my phone off because I don't need an alarm, but I have had 2 or 3 times, I have had an idea come to me for a novel while I'm falling asleep. I turn over to my husband, who is still awake, and I'm like, "Give me your phone. I need to send myself a text message, to read in the morning so I don't forget whatever it is." I'm, half asleep, none of it makes any sense. I have done that a number of times, and now what I do is I keep a document whenever I'm brainstorming story. I've given myself more time to brainstorm before I start drafting,
Yeah,
and I have just this running Google Doc on my phone of just ideas, and
yeah.
I had some when I was walking to the train to commute to my day job. I'm writing this down, I will figure it out later. I am to
I
keep that document,
I
come
use
back.
both. I have the digital stuff, but I also have my trusty pen and paper, and I live and die by my sticky notes. So the other thing you mentioned though was that leaving wiggle room for your characters to do things. And that is something else that I spend a lot of time on. I spend a lot of time on my characters. As a writer, you need to know who your characters are. You need to know their personalities and their likes and their dislikes and stuff because this helps you present them as believable people. And that's sort of one of the things that, not to toot my own horn here, but I think that's something that I do quite well as an author is I write characters that are believable. So, and that's what you were talking about, is leaving wiggle room for stuff and how things can change, is as you're writing it, you realize, yeah, no, that doesn't fit with this person's character. They wouldn't react like this. And that's something that's critically important. You need to be true to who your character is when you're writing scenes and stuff with them. You can't just, for the sake of the story, I need this to happen, so I'm just going to make this person do this, because I think that draws people out of the story. Like it's jarring.
Absolutely.
So it's one of my other sort of biggest tips for people is to get familiar with your character, know who they are. Because if you don't know who they are, your readers aren't going to know. And more importantly, they're not going to care. And if you want somebody to stay with a book, especially with a series, they need to care about the characters and be invested in them and their journey. So that's something I think that's really important.
Absolutely, like, character continuity is really important, but then also balancing it with growth, of course, that they're not so static that they never change at all throughout the course of the novel. So, some of your readers have been adults who are reading the books along with their kids or even their grandkids. As we talked about people picking up middle grade books even if they're grown-ups. I'm wondering, what do you hope that your grown-up readers will appreciate within this story, even though it is written for a middle grade audience?
Honestly, I just hope that they get the same thing the kids get out of it. I hope they're entertained. I hope they have fun with it. I hope they love the characters and want to find out what happens next. I hope they just fall in love with the story so much that they just want to keep following with the series and keep reading each next book as it comes out. I just want people to have fun with these stories. Just enjoy them.
I love that. I love that, and I don't have any kids of my own, but if I ever do, one of the things I am looking forward to is reading books together and seeing what they pick up. Last question here, I'm wondering, what is the main takeaway that you hope readers get from the Arcanium Saga?
You know the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child? I think the main thing that I want people to get out of this series is that it takes a village to do pretty much anything that's important. This is very much sort of a group adventure with these kids, learning how to depend on each other and work with everybody's strengths. And it's also about not putting pressure on one person to fix everything. So that's one of the things that in the sort of the marketing images that I use for this, it's chosen one, maybe. So there's the prophecy, and it's this whole, is it Ty, is it Aislinn? We're not sure. And there's always sort of this underrunning current here of, why do we put that much pressure on anyone, let alone a child, to save the world? And this is something that actually Aislinn brings up. She mentions that prophecies they're just gibberish and excuses people use to avoid doing the things they need to do to fix their own problems. And later in the series, somebody else mentions that you're waiting for somebody to save the world instead of trying to fix what you can when you can. And I think that's something that everybody, especially these days, needs to sort of keep in mind, because there's a lot of stuff happening out there right now. And a lot of it is not great. And I think a lot of people are sort of nervously looking around, hoping somebody else will step forward and save them. And logically, that's not going to happen. We need to save ourselves. And the way we do that, there was a phrase back in I don't know if it was the 80s or the 90s when the environmental movement really started kicking into speed. It's called think globally, act locally. And I think that's what we all need to start doing, is just take a look around in our own communities and find one thing that we can do to help make the world a better place for that community. Because if everybody did that, and we had all these tiny little actions from millions of people, that might be enough to tip the scales to make the world better for everyone. So instead of hoping for a savior and putting that much pressure on one person to try and fix things, let's work together and fix them together.
I absolutely love that. The message of, some accountability and some community, and that when we work together, we can achieve great things and we have to work together. That's definitely something that I am realizing as I grow as an adult. We look to leaders but we realize like you can still be a leader in your community, you can still take part and your actions do matter. And if everyone lives in accordance with that, then we'll tip the scales. We'll make things better for everyone. So what a great message to impart for both your middle grade readers and your guardians and family members that are reading along with them. So I think that's really neat. Hopefully the next generation of people feel more empowered to make things better in their communities as a result. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time to hop on and chat. I learned a lot. Really appreciate the deep dive into middle grade fantasy writing and really excited to have learned more about this award-winning series. Hopefully, go and check out books 1 through 4, and then they, have to wait patiently for books 5, 6, and 7. So thank you so much for hopping on and
They are
chatting with me.
coming. They will come out.
You'll just have to wait a little bit, but it'll be worth it.
Yeah, it will be. I've got plans for this series. So
Awesome. So, where can people find you and stay informed about your upcoming writing in between the waits for the different books?
the best place would be to check out my website at nptwrites.com. You can sign up for my author newsletter, which sure gets sent out when I remember to send it out. So you're not going to be bombarded with emails from me. But that's probably the best thing is keep an eye on my blog, my author blog on my website, or sign up for my newsletter.
Thank you so much for sharing more. And I hope people go and check out the Arcanium Saga.
Thank you so much. It's been a fun conversation. Thanks so much for having me.